So let us get going. There's some people, some attendees online, and it's good to see this group here. Hello, Steve. So before we get going, the groups sort of asked me to make sort of a few comments before we get going. The first one is that this is a conversation. None of us really have any answers to how we're going to get through this or what's on the other side of COVID. So this is really just a conversation to try and sort of figure out between us what's how we're going to get through this, what's on the other side. There are 12 of us on this call today. All of our profiles are on the LinkedIn pages, which are linked from the mondaylive.org website. Oh, my headphone's falling down. We're going to skip on the sort of introductions and things. The other thing is that we each represent ourselves or our individual personal views and not the views of our companies or any other organizations. We do need comments and chats and Q&A, so please do use the tool that's the Zoom tool to actually talk to us and be part of the conversation. I just see a note here from Nicholas saying the video is not working really, it seems. So I'm not quite sure what that's all about. But unless I hear otherwise, I think we should continue. So this is scheduled for an hour, and we'll see. Last week we went past that hour, so it's not a hard schedule. So that's kind of all my opening comments, and let's go round the table, as it were, and just have everybody say hello and how things are at their end. So Ken, how's things in Vancouver?
Over in the island here, everything's good. We're real happy. We've got our May issue online. We've got some good contributions. A great article by Mark.
All right, great. Mark? So Mark
Peacock. Hey, all, glad you could join us. Absolutely magnificent, gorgeous day in Richmond, Virginia. And if I was a golfer, I would have my 18 best friends calling me right now. Instead of doing this, I'd be out there with them. But anyway, welcome.
Bill.
Hello from equally beautiful Atlanta, Georgia. Welcome to this call. And I really like the fact that somebody started off by saying, boy, we don't have answers, but hopefully we'll come up with some great questions.
Jim Lee.
Jim Lee here in Massachusetts. Everything's great here. Looking forward to a good conversation.
And Leighton. We can't hear you. We cannot hear you, Leighton.
Here we go. Greetings from Salt Lake City, and I'm eager to engage in this conversation and hear how other parts of the country are starting to open up with COVID-19, May 4th being one of the start dates for some of the states.
Great. Tracy?
Hi, Tracy from Phoenix, Arizona, the 100-degree-plus city already, unfortunately. And we have started opening back up here, so we'll see. It looked like a pretty busy weekend. I happened to be out and around, so we'll see.
And Anna in Dallas.
Yeah, I know Dallas, Texas, not Perth Beach, which you see behind me, unfortunately. But the weather was also really nice, and Texas has also opened on Friday, so we're seeing some interesting dynamics moving already here in Texas.
Roger.
Yeah, sure. Roger here in UK. Weather is quite good, but a little bit cooler than you guys, about sort of 15, 16 degrees. But a lot of discussion going on here about the anticipation of going back, and it's more about the people thinking, do they want to go back, than thinking about the problems of the buildings and everything else. So there's a kind of reticence of people wanting to go back unless they feel comfortable with it.
Okay, thanks, Roger. Scott?
Hey, everyone. May the 4th be with you. All you Star Wars fans out there. Scott Hoffman from Denver, Colorado. Weather's beautiful. Colorado is starting to open back up. So looking forward to some great questions in today's chat.
And Steve?
Also from, hi Steve, also from Richmond, Virginia. I agree with Mark. I should be golfing right now because I am one of those. It's a beautiful day outside. But I think the interesting challenge on a personal level is how this is really radically changing how families operate, particularly where children are involved. It's the fact that most schools are out is really creating a secondary level of difficulty, I think, for a lot of families right now.
And from Austin, Alper.
Yeah, weather is warm. It's hot here, but everything is good over.
Okay, so what's the big news? Anybody has any big news or any impact from that from the building automation perspective? Let's open the floor up to get this thing going.
I did a quick poll round some of the customers here in the UK, and they're saying their business is down by as much as 40% than prior to. March was a kind of really brilliant month, and then now they're down by about 40% on their kind of average month. Is that the sort of figures you're seeing across the US as well?
Anybody have any figures?
I don't know that we've seen a 40% drop or anything near that. We have seen some impact, but it seems to be balancing. While we have some customers who are slow and not able to do work, we have others who have more work than they can handle because they're able to get into buildings that they can't normally get to. So it's been a little bit neutral to slightly down for us.
Leighton or Bill? I think you were going to say something.
I can say that it seems like we've weathered a 2-week period in early to mid-April that was just dark. And it does seem like it's starting to neutralize or starting to sort of get back. I don't know if that's confidence with some latest news or whatever, but our firm and our downstream, it seems like we sort of got through this dark period where there was a lot of uncertainty. While there's still uncertainty, at least things are starting to, looks like, crack open from all corners.
I'd say that building owners need to make decisions on how to proceed very quickly. To your point, Bill, the last 2 weeks have been a little bit of a floating area where people are trying to assess information, get as much data as they can on what constitutes best practices, and try to develop a game plan. And I think it's frustrating for vendors to all align themselves to with the building owners to understand what the standards are and what the guidelines are. I hope through this group we're able to share that kind of information to spread out through the community, that these are the general trends that building owners are paying attention to. And as such, the areas that we can best serve the market.
One of the interesting things I saw this week was that the restaurant industry, obviously one of the hardest hits in this whole thing, they are projecting that 30 to 35% of the restaurants will not open again. And you talk about a segment within our industry where lots of building automation, building technology is used. That's kind of an interesting prediction to hear.
Yeah, but Mark, don't you think though, and I've heard the same metrics even for here in Texas, there's a whole swag of restaurants that are not going to open. But in my mind, that just lays up a whole bunch of opportunity for new restaurateurs to come in and take up the space, you know, probably at a discounted rate. But my thought is those places will fill up again. It might not be the same restaurant, it might not be the same people, the same proprietors, but the space is still going to be occupied eventually. I don't think those places will sit empty for a long time.
It sure will be interesting. You know, I don't know one way or the other than, as I see it, that I hope you're right, that, you know, one leaves, another goes in. But I think there is still that fear of the unknown. What if this happens again? And I start my own restaurant as an example. And I think where the statistics are coming are from the large owner operators and large franchise folks, you know, people like Darden and so forth and so on. So I don't know, we'll wait and see.
Was this coming, or was this from an oversupply before, and this has just accelerated perhaps a reduction?
What I've seen is, I don't think so. It's obviously, it's a very competitive dining, outside dining is very competitive, from QSRs to fine dining and so forth and so on. But I think, you know, is this more of a course correction? Could they have been using this as a course correction? I don't know. But anyway, jury's still out. I guess we'll wait and see.
Well,
go ahead, Anna.
I was going to say, I think it's the same. It's going to be the same. What we see in restaurants is going to happen to commercial buildings. I think it'll be a new paradigm, right? Maybe new restaurants come in, maybe they have new seating configurations. The same thing's going to happen in commercial buildings. There are people who are not going to renew their lease because probably they weren't going to do it before anyway. And then, so there's a change in paradigm in how these things are. And is this raising opportunities for new people?
We do a lot of business in the restaurant space in one of my companies, and we're seeing a pretty severe impact on that part of the business. And I think it's a little different with a restaurant, and especially QSRs, as opposed to like a family dining or high-end dining, because they operate on such thin margins to begin with, and it's all about the continuous churn of the volume, right? So now we have this gap where they had no or little revenue coming in, and they're not able to weather something like that. So they will have to go through the process, the financial process of clearing or quitting or bankruptcy or whatever it might be. And if they do come back, back to what you were saying, Anno, I think there's going to be quite a long gap before we see that happening.
Yeah, the time constant is the big unknown. So I saw Nicholas Wern in the audience, and I think a lot of us are maybe a little curious as to what the hell's going on in Sweden. So, Nicholas, tell us.
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, it's I work in a more international setting, and everyone's asking me the same questions. And basically, we haven't had a lockdown or no quarantine really. So I think like we're the odd ducks, not even in Europe, but in the world, to be honest. And I think we have a high mortality rate, but in terms of building automation and all the stuff that is going on in the US, we haven't seen much of it, to be honest. There are still people going to the office, not as much as before maybe. And we had a lot of layoffs, but I mean, people are still out sipping rosé, out dining, and have like the personal responsibility to do stuff. So I think like it's more, I mean, definitely more when I talk to people in New York or California or other states in the US, there's a huge difference. And I mean, that's where I'm operating as well. But I see that from my perspective, and also engaging in a lot of LinkedIn conversations, it's a lot about creating COVID compliant buildings, whatever that is. And all the stuff that sort of like around that scenario basically, and just figuring out what the stakeholders have been and what they're going to be, and of course doing stuff remote. I mean, I think that's where companies need to be if they aren't already, I think. So, but in Sweden, yeah, it's a totally different story to the rest of the world, to be honest.
It's an interesting lead in, Nicholas, because I guess if with the US being a little bit ahead of the curve than say perhaps some places in Europe, are you guys seeing any business coming in from where buildings are going through the readiness plan? You know, last week we talked about indoor air quality and things, but is anybody actually taking actions on when people are going, you know, looking to go back to work? Are buildings actually doing anything, or is it more theatrical, saying, yeah, we're going to wipe the surfaces down and change a few things?
I've been talking to some companies in the UK as well. In the US, I haven't seen that much. I think there's a lot of preparation and a lot of planning going on. In Sweden, because I don't know, there's not that much urgency, and there's not that much of a demand for COVID compliant buildings, I think. So I don't see that much here. But there's definitely, talking to some sensor companies, and they're seeing a huge uptake in future orders and interest in indoor air quality, CO2 sensoring, all these kind of things, as well as for the novelties when it comes to UV lighting, and just making sure that if someone asks, okay, how safe is this building to go back to, they can actually provide an answer that's based on data-driven assumptions or data-driven understanding, I would say. And I think that's something that no one can really say today. Like, you have an idea, if that, but I think that's where a lot of companies are going towards. But in just responding to your question, no, I haven't seen that much of actual stuff being done. It's more a lot of talks, innovation theater to some extent. But I think there's definitely, that's what's going to be a must for a lot of the owners and a lot of the FM companies, that they have these solutions provide for the stakeholders.
Nicholas, are there any standards that are being presented as go forward steps?
Sorry, what did you say?
Are there any standards that are being presented as go forward steps for building owners that you're aware of?
Any standards?
Guidelines or recommendations?
I don't think so. Not that I've seen as in from a large entity, so to say, backing these guidelines on how that should be. I think that ASHRAE's come up with something, as always, and I think there's well-being standards and all these kind of things. But it's not something that I've seen more in a commercial approach, that it's been an uptake. It's more of the stuff that it's, sensors, CO2, we want to be able to measure these kind of things, but not in a very, I would say, organized manner or anything like that.
A lot more being pushed out by Cushman and Wakefield and JLL and people like this on guidance to go back.
The guidance that we see is published by ASHRAE, called the ASHRAE Position Document on Infectious Aerosols. It's published April 14th. And there are quite a few tangible recommendations in that document. Some of our large analytics customers are beginning to pore over their data to look at different methodologies for filtration, air changing, UV, ultraviolet light deployment and air handlers, etc., especially in healthcare applications. And people are also in healthcare applications very concerned about room pressurization. So I think that those are the tangible things that we see people looking at now from an analytics perspective.
So the topic of this week is data, and everything associated with data analytics and collection and everything else. Would like to spend the next 30 to 40 minutes on this. In our sort of planning call last week, Jim Lee, you made a sort of a statement as to why data is important, and that we all thought would be it's really sort of a good frame to actually start this discussion. Would you mind reciting that?
I'd be happy to, Anto. I think that, when people say the word analytics, the thought is, well, we'll just collect data and we'll look at that data. And that's really a view of analytics which is more useful for consumer marketing. But in physical world analytics, what we're interested in is understanding a physical model of how the world works or the problem we're trying to solve. And collecting data and organizing data and metadata so that we can actually collect that data and feed it into a physical model. And sometimes they call that digital twin. But this idea requires you to have a perspective on what problem you're trying to solve. And as we all know today, nobody's selling a COVID-19 sensor. So the question is, what are the other things that we can measure that are potentially a proxy for the virus? Other things including traditional indoor air quality measurements, CO2, measuring air changes per hour, directionality of airflows, once again, ultraviolet light and electrostatic filters for filtration. So what are the parameters? How can we solve the problem? And this ASHRAE document is useful for looking into that. But then how do we get organized to collect that data and act upon that data? But that's really the closed loop cycle of analytics in this area.
I was surprised this month that so rapidly we had 3 solutions for sort of dynamic social distancing. I thought that was kind of interesting that came online and people have products and actually videos showing how they see this going to use. It's basically piggybacked on location services. But again, more data that we've never really dealt with before falling on us.
You know, I was talking to somebody, I don't know, last week, and they use this phrase, and I'll be curious what colleagues have to think of this. Data is the new anchor in a wave of unknowns. I thought that was very, very thought-provoking. So curious, any reactions?
I kind of had a similar thought. You know, thinking about real estate and the whole sort of location has always been the mantra of real estate. And, you know, now we're talking about data, different aspects of data kind of a thing. And what occurred to me is that rather than just, in addition to just using different words, location is very physical and data is very invisible inherently. And until you actually do something with it and actually produce some actionable piece of information. So it's kind of on the same line that it's kind of invisible stuff that's going to be valuable in the future.
Yeah, Mark, I'll say to that too. Whenever I think about something or I assume something or I sort of have a feeling of how something is, as soon as I'm able to get the hard data, there's usually very little connection to what I felt or thought and actually saw in the hard data.
Right.
Guys, I'd like to just weigh in on with the following thought, which is, you know, the data that we've instrumented our buildings with up to this point have been related primarily to controlling mechanical and electrical systems and or the energy consumption. And I think I believe what's changing now as a result of COVID is that tenants, occupants are going to want to know what the environment is like. And if you think about, you walk into a building, you might see a temperature sensor on the wall. It may, in many cases, doesn't even have a display on it. So what is the data that tenants are going to want in order to feel comfortable? And how do we give them that data? So in most cases, the data is not the cost of the control system is built into the lease payment. But there isn't this concept that we deliver a certain collection of information to the tenants, and how is that information going to be given to them? Do they see it on an app? Do they see it on a kiosk somewhere in the building? Are there monitors dedicated? But I do think the expectation is I want to know something about the building health and what is that information going to contain and how am I going to see it so that I as an occupant can feel comfortable being in this space. What do you guys think of that?
Well, it opens up the whole spectrum to a whole bunch of new devices, sensors, data, because we're talking about all this data and data analytics and stuff, but as the space that we're in and the building automation space, we don't collect, pick a number, 1/3 of that data that they're going to be interested in, right? There's some elements. We don't have sensors everywhere. We don't have sensors in the spectrum that they want them in. The IoT guys are going to come in. IoT guys are going to come in and offer all sorts of solutions, right? And because this is a prime opportunity to bring a new sensor, a new device. Cloud is going to become accepted because it's the quickest way to deliver a solution. And then we're going to quickly get swamped. The poor building owner is going to quickly get swamped by you know, going from no solutions this week to, you know, 100 solutions in 2 months' time, right? And then how does he work through that equation?
Brings a good point, Anno, is that, you know, really the data is not going to be available until sometime down the line. So is the data and the analytics going to be used for verification? Because, you know, you haven't got any history at the moment. You haven't got any data. So it's not until the buildings are occupied again and people are moving around and entering the building that we'll be able to actually get that stuff. So will data be used for verification initially more than solutions, and then start looking at, you know, modifying after the event?
So one of the conversations that we've had in the past 2-3 weeks is this whole notion of some kind of measure or certification of the health or the healthiness of a building, or the quality of the building for the purposes of human occupation. And there are a couple of initiatives going on. And one of the initiatives that I've been sort of having email conversations with is WELL. And I'm going to pull in Karen Quintana, that I've had an email exchange over the past few days. Hey, Karen, good to see you. Wondering if you can just give a brief sort of explanation of what WELL is and how you see data playing into that, given the conversation that.
Hi there. Thank you, Anto. I didn't know I was going to be like mystery door number 3.
Yeah.
I thought I was just going to be joining the conversation today. So. Dramatic entrance. Hi guys, my name is Karen Quintana, Vice President of the Digital Product at the International Well Building Institute. So some of you may have heard of well buildings, healthy buildings, well certification. That's what we work on. Anto reached out because we have a global task force that is thinking more evergreen than just this. Obviously, there's a lot of re-entry things out there that obviously are really useful, targeted to very specific building systems. The Well Building Standard was created in 2014, and it really outlines the design of a building, the operations and maintenance of a building, the people policies that you can have in place in a building, the food environment that you create for people in the building, mental health, physical activity, all sorts of things that you can choose to add to make sure that that space is promoting sort of optimal human experience, you know, and some of them are very easy to add after the fact. Some of them are, if it's not in the design already, it's kind of hard to get done. But essentially, organizations, landlords, or tenants can pursue a rating with WELL about how, you know, kind of essentially how healthy their space is. And so it's been exciting 5 years or so in 60 countries globally. We've got projects, you know, a lot of core and shell projects, a lot of organizations who do well across their portfolio. So as you can imagine, right now is a crazy busy time for us, because what used to be a conversation where, you know, for these 5,000 projects across the world, they were, you know, what's the ROI and all of this, and now it's like, oh my God, how do I verify that I'm doing the right things? And so, you know, people are now starting to revisit WELL and kind of making a really holistic approach to the types of systems that they're using, the types of data that they're gathering, how they translate that data into good policies over time, and maybe not overreact or overspend on, you know, I think it was Jim mentioning like UV lights and all these things that some technologies, you know, some buildings, the risk might be high enough to say that's a great investment or whatever. But the nice thing is that there are, you know, a set of standards that you can use that include things like infectious disease, but also go beyond that. And so one of the key pillars of WELL that sort of make it different from something like LEED is that we do on-site testing in a building to test the air quality, test the water quality, test the lighting levels, test the acoustics of a space, and really make sure that the building is performing as intended. And so I'll stop there and just sort of, that's a bit of an intro as to, you know, the well building standard, and see, Anto, if there's any particular direction.
Well, I've got this is Mark Peacock. I've got 2 comments for the group, or 2 suggestions or conversation topics based on what, you know, from what you said and we've said. So what's the right baseline to start? Data, you can collect all the data, you can do all the analytics, and obviously Jim Lee knows this better than all of us. What is the baseline? Do we need to establish a baseline? What will be those baselines? So that's thought 1. Thought 2 was, as you were, Karen, as you were kind of bringing this on, one of the things that struck me is, obviously during this whole time, I did a telehealth thing with my doctor. Didn't go see him, whatever, you know, hey, how are you? Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Are we going to get to a point where we have telehealth programs for buildings? And an owner and operator wants to know, obviously, the occupants, again, can call up at any point in time a telehealth program to see how that building is performing and so forth and so on. So 2 concepts, baseline and telehealth. If you guys want to discuss it, have at it.
Yeah, from WELL's perspective, you know, it's fundamental things like air quality testing, water quality testing. You know, if buildings are sitting dormant, you know, are you paying attention to possible Legionnaires? Air quality. Are we turning off recirculation if possible, and you know, increasing the supply of outdoor air, changing filters? You know, I don't know if any of you guys on the line know Dr. Joe Allen from Harvard, but he is a must follow kind of guy on Twitter, and he's on the news all the time now. And he recently published a book about healthy buildings, you know, and it's like 9 out of the 10 things you're going to need to do are going to be invisible to tenants, but it's important to kind of have them in a little package where you can kind of say, hey, we're doing these things. We've changed these, you know, it's really the basics. You know, we don't have, we have a lot of great strategies that might be innovative to some people, but to others, it's, you know, best practice. It's doing the commissioning so you know what the data actually is. And you could say, we conducted the test on this date at this time, and this is our baseline for reentry. And we're committed to these principles, you know, at a regular basis over time, not just in response to the current public sentiment.
You know, if I could chime in on this a little bit too. So Mark, to your point, we already have telemedicine for buildings, right? I mean, we have hundreds and hundreds of buildings on our platform that we're connected live to. And we're watching those all the time. They're sending us alarms. We're interacting with those buildings on a daily basis to make sure that they stay up and running. And coincidentally, most of those are restaurants. So I think the tricky part about all of this is there is a structure to all of this data and categories that we have to think about. So data for certification, data for facilities people who are operating the equipment versus the data that will feed to the public. Significantly different approach to each of those types of information that we have to consider in all of this. And, you know, the biggest mistake that I think a lot of people make when they first get into this is the amount of data that we can collect can become very overwhelming very quickly. And then everyone just turns it off in their head, right? Everybody's very interested during the honeymoon period in the first few months. At least this has been our experience. And then it's just too much, and really it becomes a situation where they want to manage by exception only at that point, right? So data is fine by itself, but ultimately I think we need to talk a little bit about, okay, what do we do with that data? and where does that lead us in terms of, you know, machine learning and proactivity and, you know, decisions or actionable information. There's kind of an evolution that happens once you start down the data path here a little bit.
I would agree with that, Tracy. I would also say that it's absolutely true that we've been monitoring buildings, and I think that we have baselines for a lot of important things already. You know, we're not in the same verticals. We're more doing higher education, healthcare, pharma, and life science. But we have a tremendous amount of data and baselines on how these facilities are operating, including some things that are interesting, particle counts, air changes per hour. What we don't have is new data that might be interesting as proxies for the spread of COVID-19 or other pathogens. So the question is how can we, you know, get some of that data that Anto mentioned that's going to be coming on and synthesize it into what we already have to create a more holistic value proposition for people.
I got a couple of comments on all that's been said, I think. First of all, I think, Karen, I mean, thanks a lot for joining in. I think it's a breath of fresh air as well, speaking of industry humor, actually. So in terms of harmonization of data, and basically what Mark said as well about data as the anchor in a wave of unknowns, how do companies feel like with trusting the data? Because what I feel like when I talk to technical asset managers or basically anyone that tries to do something, it's a lot of first acquiring the data, making sense of the data, and of course trusting the data from the get-go. And then of course it's cross-interdisciplinary stuff, which Tracy is talking about, and it's all of these kind of things. So how do you, or how does the customers, what do they say about the harmonization of data and the sense making and be able to trust the data from the get-go? For Tracy, I think.
With the risking monopolizing here a little bit, we have some very direct experience with that. And Nicholas, you hit on something that's super important. And it's like in life, you know, it takes a very, very long time to build trust, and you can lose it in an instant. And the same applies to data, right? It's amazing how we can lose the trust of a customer with one bad sensor that happened to collect a bunch of information that decisions were made around, or just becomes even a little bit off and a little bit questionable, you know, and they end up walking into rooms with all sorts of different kinds of inaccurate temperature measurement devices and thermostats and thermometers. And then of course the one that they have in their hand, even though they bought it for $2, you know, at the local Walmart, is way more accurate than my $150 sensor that's NIST certified that I put in there. So it is a problem. You hit on something that's really important there when it comes to the data.
So I brought in Keith Gibson. He's been crunching data around buildings and energy for a while. You've been listening to this, Keith?
Yep. Hey guys, how you doing?
Hey, Keith.
I had to crack up about the most accurate sensor because I just told somebody about that experience 20 years ago when I was trying to calibrate a building when I worked at Honeywell, and I had my NIST certified UL listed, you know, temperature sensor and humidity, and the guy pulls out the little piece of crap, little Powers thermometer that they had for 15 years, and he said, "We're gonna use this." And I was like, "But this isn't." He's like, "We're gonna use this." And so that taught me what the most accurate sensor is the one that the customer has in his hand or his pocket.
I think that's, sorry, Keith, that's Mark. This is the quote of the day. You're going to use this. We got to steal that. Anyway, go ahead.
I can identify with that.
It happens daily to us, by the way, Keith. That happens all the time.
Yeah.
Are there enough data scientists or people who know what to do with the data? I mean, okay, we can go with machine learning and AI, but are there enough people in the industry to actually know what to do with the information and what actions to take once they've got it?
I think that's a twofold question, right? I mean, the data scientists right now in all more or less industries are just stuck cleaning the data, which again goes back to trusting the data or metadata tagging or interoperability and all these kind of things. But it's not so much them working in silos. They have to work with Jim or Tracy or Mark or Ken or Leighton or Bill or I mean, all of the people here to be able to make sense of the data to actually create these algorithms or strategies together, right? Or, which is coming more and more, is low code, no code platforms, where you actually enable domain experts to make the most of the data themselves. So that's basically not using the data scientists as much, not using machine learning and AI algorithms, but based on the raw data, but you actually have low code, no code platforms where you can drag and drop in a kind of way that allows it to do it at that extent. So I think that's definitely where the whole industry is moving towards, to be honest. And the data
I think
scientists—
that is a good point, is that a lot of this in the past, all of the data was connected to one system. And we're definitely seeing a trend as the data is getting analyzed on the edge, and the edge controllers are becoming more powerful. AI is actually part of them. This helps us sort out this giant data jungle. And the other thing I think is the platforms of trust. Each one of them kind of brings with them their own platform of trust, and we start to integrate this data. And that's kind of a new concept for us as an industry, because we've always sort of looked at one vendor, he supplies all the data in that project. And that's not the case now. There'll be 4 or 5, maybe 15. And there's obviously going to be a whole new wave of folks providing data into our buildings. So
I agree with Ken on this topic, data quality, passing a data byte from one platform to another or one medium to another. We tend to make mistakes or the data gets corrupted. So storing data where the data is created will help us bunch over the data quality issues, and we can analyze it right in there as well. So that architecture will be the future for sure.
So I've also pulled in Steve Jones that's joined us. He knows a thing or two about parsing data or normalizing data. Steve? Go ahead, Steve. You're on. Oh, we can't hear you.
He made it. We see his name, but not his picture.
Hey, Keith Gibson, weren't you and Steve Jones young programmers at Johnson Controls like 30 years ago or something?
Yeah, we were systems integrators. Yeah, Johnson came up with this program where they wanted to be more responsive to customer requests. And my boss walked up to me and said, "Hey, Keith, do you know how to program?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "Okay, you're going to be a systems integrator for Johnson Controls." I'm like, "Okay, great." And I was the Western region systems integrator for Johnson. I believe Steve was on the East Coast. And anything west of the Mississippi, pretty much I grabbed, and I think he took the lion's share of what was east of Mississippi. So yeah, we were both worked for Milwaukee.
And you haven't aged a day, Keith.
Forever young Keith.
You haven't aged a day.
Oh, everybody says it. Thank you.
While we're waiting for Steve to maybe get his technology worked out there a little bit, we talked when we started about questions, and one of the questions that I've been trying to research a little bit here is kind of circles around a number of the topics that we were talking about so far today. And that is, can we use this data in the sensors and the information that we're already collecting in any way to classify the probable outcome or likelihood of a building being worse or better, as the case may be, than another set of conditions? So whether, this comes back to IAQ a little bit, but, what are the worst possible conditions to promote the transmission and or growth of a virus in a building? And do we have a profile, at least a directional indication? More humid is better, less humid is not as good, cooler is not as good, warmer is better. Can somebody talk about that? I don't know that I've seen any good information about that.
The ASHRAE guideline that I mentioned before, Tracy, actually points that out and provides, let's call it preliminary chapter and verse on it. It certainly an early document, but there are a number of answers to those questions. So I can post it up later. I don't have it in front of me. But
I mean, ultimately, this is what we need to understand as controls people, right? Which way do we guide the buildings to get to the best condition? It's, you know, I know, Leighton, you're involved with marijuana grow industry, and one of the big things here in Arizona around that industry is all about what are the conditions that produce plants that produce the best results, right? And when we just take that approach to buildings too, what are the conditions that we can create to create the best occupant situation?
So specifically in the cannabis industry, there's something known as vapor pressure deficit, or VPD. And this is kind of like a psychometric chart on steroids, but there's a very fine, narrow band during the grow process, at least for cannabis, during the cloning, the vegetative, and then the flowering stages that optimize the plant along the ways that you just described. Now, the companies that serve that space have been the more traditional, either horticultural firms that don't pay that much attention to that, or the traditional BAS companies that come in and install equipment. And when they do that, they don't pay attention to that either. So there's a set of standards out related to vapor pressure deficit that define the equipment and systems and the capabilities of the systems to maintain that very narrow bandwidth of precise humidity during day and night. And I think we may see an introduction of that into the build space in terms of what qualifies for an HVAC system, what are the control strategies, and how does one actually fine tune that system to be able to maintain that? That may be something that comes out of this whole COVID situation, which is humidity now is the key defining attribute of what makes a successful or a safe environment to be in.
Yeah, I actually heard something interesting talking to, I can't remember who it was, but you know, in Italy, there has been, I think, except for New York, there's been a lot of deaths related to COVID. And I think one of the theories by some industry experts were that just because of humidity. Because of the humidity and it was the north of Italy, that's why it spread so fast. And of course, there was a couple of football stadiums in the mix in the beginning, as well as older generation living together with the other generations. But I think like that's what I've heard as well, that humidity and temperature has a huge effect on this. And again, like that goes back to the COVID-19 compliant buildings that you need to be able to answer at least, okay, what is the status? What is the state floor by floor, maybe room by room, that you have to measure these temperature, humidity, all of these kind of things that you don't measure today, I believe.
In the grow space, in addition to the HVAC system, there's a dehumidification system and a humidification system. And all three of them have to operate in a coordinated fashion and maintain that level of humidity, that precise level. I don't often see that in commercial buildings.
But I guess, Leighton, the plants can't complain, but people might if the humidity and the temperature are not what they are expecting. That's going to be a challenge for them too, because I think that the kind of numbers that they're proposing and kind of are outside of people's normal comfort levels.
I totally agree with that, Roger. We the range is 40 to 60% humidity, and in the well building standard, it's what we call an optimization. It's like optional. It's not one of the minimum requirements, and we see very few projects pursue it because how hard it is, to maintain that, whatever. But it's interesting because increasing the ventilation or using HEPA filters, some pretty straightforward things coupled with increasing your training protocols, making sure your staff are trained on these new protocols, and thinking about the use cases and really translating them for clients. Because I think when you see like the Purdue outbreak, the management said, oh yeah, we told them to stay 6 feet apart, but the assembly line conditions were in no way adapted to accommodate for that. And so really helping them to think more big picture about like even something like, the hand washing facilities that they have access to and everything, like, how easy is it for people to access PPE or hand washing, doing the basics well, I think is pretty important.
Aaron,
So,
does your
Steve,
well, sorry.
I was going to say Steve is having problems with his mic. He's wondering he's making a comment that we will need to define what data is needed. I guess what data is needed to support trying to show these things that we've been talking about in terms of what's good.
All of the data, everything.
Well, that's my question for Karen. Since the Well Building Institute has a standard here, does your standard incorporate a health standard of some sort so far in your?
So a lot of our air related strategies do often cite ASHRAE directly, and it sort of just depends on the category to whom, but we aren't an ANSI accredited standards writing body. So what we do is share all the references, all the research that shows physical activity incentives can impact people. So so we are sort of the conduit of assembling the research that shows that these things can have an impact, and then creating the construct of how people sort of have a scorecard and measure themselves, and do that consistently globally. And the same GBCI, the same organization that certifies LEED projects, oversees the on-site testing component. So they do.
Yeah, well, I guess that's my fundamental question is just like you have, LEED, you have, gold and platinum type buildings, which indicate a certain level of energy performance. Should the industry be moving to something equivalent on the health side?
Yeah, I think it's something we've been talking about for 5 years as the second wave of sustainability, is that high performance buildings should be designed, with energy efficiency and, occupant experience in mind. They, a lot of good studies on the ROI of that, but now it's like definitely shifting from a nice to have to sort of like a minimum, as people want that list. They want to know all the things that you're doing, and they'd like to be able to benchmark that, internally across buildings and against their peers.
Yeah.
So we have a portfolio program. So, you have like Uber has their, buildings in there, and so they can know which buildings have MERV 13 filters and which ones don't. So that's one piece of data. It's specific to our program, but it is interesting, and they do have an effect. Like, we have owners be really nervous that they'll fail, but when they fail, they solve things. They pick up. We had a luxury multifamily building that kept failing the air quality test, and they're like, but we have these great systems. What happened? And it was the pressurization of their super fancy elevator was pushing all this unfiltered air into the hallways and causing them to fail. So they were able to recalibrate that with minimal notice to the tenants, and really, but it was because they were testing, they had access to the data, what the levels actually were, they could respond to it.
Yeah, and if you can imagine where whatever data we decide was needed, if a building owner were confident enough to post that where tenants could subscribe to it and get the statistics live, they would walk into the building, walk to any floor, and know what to expect.
Health for buildings.
Karen, are you seeing any consultants in this space turning up who are taking any initiative or lead on what you're talking about?
Yeah, so we have, a Well AP credential like the LEED AP. So we have, a whole slew, but a lot of those that you guys already looked at, I think the Cushman, JLL, CBRE have also put out, reentry guidance. HOK is another big leader in workplace strategy. Most of the largest chunk of our projects are commercial office buildings, but we have an airport advisory, industrial advisory, schools, school districts and things that are signed up. So certainly can and do it in other places. But yeah, a lot of individuals who have specialty, and then firms, who can do more broadly. And then we have testing agents. So people who do the on-site testing for or who have a sensor platform that can feed some of the data to help them achieve their rating.
There's going to be pressure upwards from the people who are working and attending the buildings, beginning to ask, is their building okay, and stuff like that. So I think it's going to be a groundswell coming from the bottom up that's going to force some decisions and actions on the building owners.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like I wrote something down when Karen was talking here that if HVAC people or building automation people and companies can't provide data to anyone that wants it, I mean, then someone else will work with some other company that can provide it. And everyone in this business will definitely be out of the loop, because the fact is that if you want to make assumptions or if you want to have control strategies made, you want to be able to use as much data as possible, not only from HVAC, but from lighting, occupancy, other data, climate data, outside data, all these kind of things together coming from sensors. And I think that's again where there are harmonization platforms out there. There are digital twin perspectives that's going to do this in the long run. There are the sensors that Jim wants as well that basically are BACnet mesh sensors that talk BACnet through and through from the get-go, that just plug and play. But that's what's going to put a pressure on existing companies and really, really want to move fast in this space and become digital. Because otherwise, yeah, they're going to be non-existent in the next 2 years. I mean, that's what everyone is saying as well. Like something that should take like 10 years before COVID, that's going to take 1 year or 2 years right now. And it's again, like it's the speed, that's everything, I think.
And this is the comments that I've been sharing with Karen over the last few days, chatting by email, that this group here is really about HVAC and also about the analytics side of it and about gathering the data, right? And you know, it's asking the question, how can we channel this towards helping what you are doing at Well and potentially other initiatives, and may not be the only one, but that's fine. Because it seems to be missing. When I was looking at the COVID task force link that you sent, it didn't talk about IT, didn't talk about IoT, didn't talk about any of the sort of information being valuable for the purposes of keeping buildings and occupants healthy.
Yeah, that's one reason why there's close to 500 task force members globally. You've got former surgeons general, lots of really interesting, people on the task force, but they definitely are often more academic, more, thinking about the research. That's why I'm always trying to bring in more building scientists to continue to add to that, but not specifically IoT. It's like there aren't that many, I think it was Jim said, there aren't that many things that are sensor measurable about this. You can track, are your systems performing to, have you checked off these criteria on your list? But I think you can add value by being, I said holistic many times, but like, are you connecting the dots and making kind of a whole package where you're thinking about this area of the building is too densely occupied right now, or these spaces need cleaning according to our higher touch cleaning protocols, or X number of people have entered the building and pressed the elevator button, all morning long, or like, how can you use this kind of more of an ecosystem? And then, like I said, evergreen, beyond just infectious disease transmission, really thinking about, sound sensors and movement sensors throughout a space, that sort of are about people and their satisfaction, that are visible to them. People like to pursue the indoor air quality monitoring feature of Well, because it's like, they achieve all the standards, they pass the test, but nobody can see that. The air quality monitors that are there that show all these, data points, people are like, oh, I've got better air, and we test the water quality. But then all of a sudden they put up a little sign that says, oh, like, we've tested this. And they're like, oh, great, drinking water, it's filtered and tested, great. So these things really, we see in practice that that validation point of knowing that you've been third-party tested, or that you have the data to back it up, is proving to be something consumers want.
Great. So any other sort of different angles of data? I mean, we talked about the collection and what's needed. I think we talked last week about displaying it or doing some kind of mechanism. And any other sort of angles that anybody want to chime in on?
How about the importance now of real-time data? There's all different types of data, as we all know, and whatever. how has this, or is this going to change the whole concept of what, you know, it's got to be real-time data, period. So I see Nicholas nodding his head. So that's thanks,
No,
Nicholas. That's a good one. Thank you.
No, I've been working in this industry now for, what is it, 5 or 6 years, I think. And every twist and turn, I've not really been satisfied, just moving left, right, and center and trying to find the best solutions. Also looking, I mean, for construction to Industry 4.0 initiatives, talking to Netflix, Google, all these kind of companies that I sort of have done it in other industries. And I think like definitely real time that's needed. Especially now. I mean, you can't say, yeah, 2 months ago we had great indoor air quality. Now we don't know, right? Or even if it's like 5 days ago or 10 days ago. So I think that's where it's moving, and that puts a lot of pressure on all existing systems to be able to modernize and to be able to move away from vendor lock-in and all these kind of things. And again, like from this industry perspective, from building automation, to be able to hand the data that we have control over on a platter to anyone that wants it. If you can't do that in real time, then, well, I think that's where other companies are definitely going to come in.
And then I agree with Nicholas, because I think that, you know, when you time back to something that Tracy was talking about earlier, if you're going to generate a problem or some information, then you automatically want to generate the works order, get the thing fixed even before the customer knows he's got a problem. That can only come from real time, where you're actually monitoring the thing that comes through, gets it to the operational center or the system. Even the people there don't even know, generate the works order and get it, you know, into the hands of the right person. So you got the right person attending the site with the right part and the right downtime.
Yeah, and I think if you think of the importance of real time, let's say you're getting all this data, you're collecting all this stuff and you're analyzing it, and then a red flag pops up, an alarm. All of a sudden we're getting more particulates in the air or whatever that might be. It's almost like how emergency, they'll shut down part of the building if there's an anthrax thing and things like that. So I see that has to be part of this solution eventually, is to be able to detect it real time and then obviously do something immediately. The other part of data, which I think is going to be part of this COVID-19 discussion with the new data points we all are kind of hinting towards, is who owns the data?
Yeah.
That question's always asked when talking about data, but I'm not sure that's a real question, because maybe
totally
nobody owns the data.
Frank.
Is
totally
well, no, but it's all about access to data. It's not the ownership of data. Who has access to data? Who controls that access?
I disagree. It depends, I think. Like from the longer, let's say, okay, just quick then. If you get into a building, you create this digital twin of sorts. Doesn't have to be visual or anything. It's just like a data layer that it's then accessible by someone. Then you start making money out of it, right? And then you got to sell the building. And then, okay, you sell the building, the physical structure, but you also have the data somewhere in a database. Someone is definitely going to hijack that or control it to some extent, right? Then you might be able to sell the building twice. So then it becomes really a matter of who owns the data, not only accessing the data, because it's not only a store for information based on passive information that no one really cares about. This is real-time revenue streams that are coming in for the building that might not necessarily have all that much to do about anything inside the building, but it's just like the services offered to the tenants or whatever it could be. So like who owns the data, who accesses it, all these things are going to come up much, much more and more.
And our friend Anno, we know of a issue in the past that where the data was held hostage. And, you know, so unless in this particular case that the true building owner basically paid out, the service provider was not giving them access to data.
Isn't this the normal state of things in vendor lock-in?
Right, but when it comes to the health of people, I'm sure there will be some regulatory sort of framework about making that kind of.
Yeah, it'd be like FDA.
Hope so. I hope so. Yeah.
I was very.
We have GDPR in Europe, but.
I was curious about in China, where they are more often, or in Asia more broadly, where they're measuring fevers at building entrances all over as a standard practice. You know, during times like how does that go? Certainly in the U.S., the climate is a little different. I'm curious if that's a precaution measure that people start to want to talk about.
When it's a public health data.
There of privacy versus safety, which is a whole new subject.
That could change things, right? If it's a public health kind of a situation. So
yeah, like sports arenas. Like, when do you think public sentiment will change that we just see 60,000 people shoulder to shoulder? You know,
But your point about the temperature measurement, Karen, in Asia, the metric we had last week when we talked about this, you know, post 9/11, you used to be able to walk into a building and do visitor without any problem. Now you have to go to a visitor management station. You've got to get a ticket. You've got to go through a turnstile. And here we are, umpteen years later, we're still doing that. So some of these standards will become just part of the norm. Yeah.
So we have a team of 40 in Asia, different Shanghai and other cities, and they're telling us that they are obviously a couple months, you know, a little bit ahead of us in the pandemic, but they're like at restaurants, everyone's wearing a mask, but they're in crowded restaurants, shoulder to shoulder, like that shaking hands and giving hugs happens, you know, and like, I know right now we're doing the elbow thing, but like, how long how long does it take us to get back to that sense? You know, for them, they're there, so they're kind of communicating back to us like what that's like.
Much different than out here in LA. I don't know if you guys heard about what happened over the weekend at the beaches out here in LA, California. They had cops that showed up. There was a bunch of people just protesting in LA, like, you're not going to keep me in the house and it's freedom, you know, whatever. They had cops that were actually punching people's driver's licenses when they were stopping them. And the implication is that if you get COVID and you show up to a hospital and you have a punch license, they're not going to treat you. That happened over the weekend in California. Wow. Unbelievable.
Fines here in the UK.
So talk about compliance. I mean,
yeah, talk about breaking the law, though.
That's a fine. You know, the fine.
That's when you bring your passport, right? Isn't it?
That's a whole nother discussion. Yeah, let's not go there.
Let's not go there.
Yeah, exactly.
That whole question is much bigger than this group. That's for sure.
Going to, though, our systems might be going to that place. We start. I mean, data. If any kind of data can be used against a person. I mean, imagine if you had an outbreak at a building and you had some sort of, you know, data transparency requirement and, you know, red flag law, you know, all kinds
of stuff. Isn't Google getting involved with that? Like showing, you know, helping public health agencies know where people have been.
Yeah, contact tracing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's here.
Yeah. That's going to be a battle for the decades. I don't think that's going to get solved this year or on this pandemic, actually. I mean, it's the same thing with video feeds, right? Now there's all kinds of legal stuff going on with public video feeds, and who owns that data? And, you know, do they have the right to use my image because I walked down the street or drove my car down a freeway, or, you know, what?
Yeah.
Okay, so it's 4:10. Let's end on a happier note. What are you guys looking forward to in the next week or something? Some happy stuff. Happy talk.
Well, I just a thought about all of this data that, you know, the one good thing that we can say today that we couldn't say even 5 years ago is the amount of information, the amount of data that is available for us to utilize to help figure out these problems is orders of magnitude ahead of where we were. And now it's a matter of how do we figure it out? We've got real-time networks. We've got lots and lots of bandwidth and compute power, which is the good news in all of this. Now we just have to figure out how to direct this to solve a particular problem at any point in time. So the fact that we have all of that and have platforms that are very cost-effective now to be able to do this kind of thing is amazing to me. It's a whole new world compared to even 5 years ago.
On the computing power note, also the devices are now open source. So there are Raspberry Pis, BeagleBones, and other open devices. And there are other initiatives that makes it easier to get the data and store it on the edge. So the edge analytics side, the prices will go down and the compute power will go up. And I think we'll be able to do these much easily than where we were before in 10 years ago.
I'm optimistic that because this is all coming online now, we all got rebooted and we basically are now all coming back online at a different time. And I'm taking great strength from the fact that that is good, that we're not all coming back on the exact same nanosecond. It's a global kind of a thing. We can watch what's happening in other countries. We can watch other people reboot, see how they come up, see if they have to reboot again and change their parameters. So it's all about adaptation. And the other thing we keep talking about is we seem to be trying to find a global or even a North American solution or a Canadian solution or whatever. I don't think it's going to be that simple. I think it's going to go right down to a city and even a community type of adaptation. So everything has to be a whole lot more flexible, and we're going to actually, it's going to be more complicated, and it's going to adapt, and we're going to have to readapt it. You know, you're going to have to, no matter how you set it out, you're going to have to, you got to plan on it being changed. The words that Nicholas and James came up with, the anti-fragile. I love that word. The fact that it actually has to survive being broken because it's going to be broken again.
And I think on a positive, to your point, Anto, is we have solved how to access the data. And if we talked several years ago, that was still a challenge. That is not a challenge today, no matter what that data is, okay? Again, so that's extremely positive. And where obviously part of this discussion is, and where we're going is, what data do we need and must have to add to all the other data points we already gathered?
Yeah. I'm super positive because I'm working now with a construction company. I signed them on this weekend, actually. So we're going to build smart from start. So we're never going to have this discussion again about building automation. It's just going to be a self-driving building, not. But that's going to be interesting, at least, to work with them and see how they can build smart from start. And yeah, I'm super hopeful. I think, again, like, especially what Mark is saying, I mean, accessing the data, hopefully that's not so much of a problem anymore. But it's, again, like the data to impact loop. So data, turning that into information, information to insights, insights to action, action to actually impact, and whatever that impact leads to. And I think that data to impact loop is all, like, that's very broken still. And I think that's something that I'm using today, just when talking to customers and figuring out where to start. Again, like, but it's very optimistic. And I think everyone now wants to digitize and focus more on people and not just energy efficiency for the purpose of energy efficiency, I think.
Can I piggyback off that one? And I'm just excited and optimistic that this is your moment, actually, of all the people in this equation. You know, the people who operate your buildings can have more impact on you than your doctor is a pretty big deal. And it's a very exciting time. If you've ever had trouble getting your client's ear or getting them on the phone, now is not that time. They are looking to us and to you to, you know, help navigate them. And so it's really exciting that you guys are here talking about rooting all that in data and use, you know, taking a data centric approach. And to me, that's very inspiring. So thanks for having me, letting me join.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I mean, that is at the heart of it. I mean, we're the movers and shakers of the industry, and we have the choice to do this or not. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I left my last company a couple of weeks ago. I mean, I always said, like, you know, in the new company, it's going to be automated. Like Nicholas said, I like the smart from the start, because I mean, I guarantee you the new company, whatever solution or technology we come up with, if it's not automated, and it requires turning a wrench, it will not be come out of my system. So it's going to be, we're going to be doing automated optimization of buildings, and what the system can't optimize, we'll give that alarm to the BAS vendor or somebody else to work on. But my stuff is not going to do any of that stuff. So I mean, it's we're the ones that are going to make this revolution happen.
Yeah. Good.
Any other concluding thoughts? Okay. Well, this.
I want to finish with the last word. It's again, like I'm working with a couple of other companies, big and small, and everyone is trying to make sense of the data that they have, right? But for the few ones that maybe read my article, it's about the data that companies don't have. That's what everything is about, including the companies that are here, the companies that we're working with, and it's the data that they don't have that will change their life. So understanding that point and what to do with, well, that data piece of information, I think that's super, super important. Yeah, so that's it.
Thank you, Nicholas.
Cool. Yeah, thank you. And so this has been a wonderful conversation. So I thank you for being here. I thank our guests. And we shall be on YouTube. This will be on YouTube in about a couple of hours once we do a little bit of tidying up. And we'll also be back on next Monday live. Yay. Bye, everybody.
Thank you, Anto.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anto.
Later.